Chapter 15. The Mah-Jongg Dealer. "Let's get off the plane," Bess urged in a tense whisper. Nancy shook her head. "Maybe it isn't a bomb. Perhaps someone is trying to smuggle goods out of the United States." The student group sat in strained silence. They could plainly hear a woman in the first-class section arguing loudly. Nancy recognized Mrs. Truesdale's voice. "This is an outrage," she was shouting. "I am telling you here and now that it's a disgraceful procedure. Can't a person take a trip out of the United States without being treated like a common thief?" Nancy and her friends had to smile in spite of the fact that there might be a bomb aboard. George remarked, "That woman is a pain." Presently, 2 police officers came to the rear part of the aircraft and inspected everyone's hand luggage. As they finished their checkup and started toward the door, Nancy asked them, "Could you tell us why you searched our bags? Or is that against regulations?" One of the officers looked at her intently, then said, "I'm sure there's no harm in telling you. Someone phoned the airport that a bomb was being carried in the hand luggage of a passenger on this plane. It must have been a crank. We did not find anything." "Thank goodness," said Bess. The officers left the plane, and a few minutes later the craft finally took off. It had been in the air about an hour when Nancy saw her father walking back toward her. "I think it's all right now for me to speak to you," he said, a twinkle in his eye. The lawyer perched on the arm of his daughter's chair. "I've been engaging various men in conversation," he said in a low tone. "All seem to be in legitimate businesses. I'm sure there are no suspects among them." "Did you know that the police were looking for a bomb?" Nancy asked. Mr. Drew nodded. Nancy told him about the bomb threat the girls had received and about her own ruse to keep one from being placed in the plane. Mr. Drew frowned. "I believe your trick worked for a while, but the gang probably had you trailed to be sure. There was no time to place a bomb aboard, but they still hoped to scare you and try to keep you from going to Hong Kong." Nancy whispered, "This must surely mean the gang has transferred its operations to Hong Kong." Mr. Drew agreed. He got up and returned to his seat. Gradually, during the flight, Nancy made the acquaintance of the students and in her own subtle way quizzed each one to see if by any chance there was a suspect among them. She came to the conclusion there was none. Members of the gang holding Chi-Che must have gone by some other route, the girl detective told herself. The great plane stopped at Anchorage, Alaska for refueling. Nancy and her friends were intrigued by the beautiful city. They were amazed at its size and the tall modern buildings. "This used to be the capital," said Bess, "but now Juneau is." Nancy remarked, "I'd love to come to Alaska in the middle of winter, ride on a dog sled." The travelers' next landing was Tokyo, Japan. What a bustling place the airport was! The girls were fascinated by the native people, most of whom wore Western dress, but many had on kimonos and sandals. Everyone seemed good-natured, and there was lots of laughter. Men and women always bowed low to one another in greeting or when saying goodbye. The 20 minutes during which the travelers were allowed to visit the terminal were soon up, and Nancy and her friends climbed back into the plane. It was now 2:00 Sunday afternoon. By the time they reached their destination, it was exactly 11 hours later than it was in New York. As the plane began its Hong Kong descent, George looked at her watch and grinned. "It's 1:00 yesterday afternoon in New York," she said. The plane set down and taxied toward the airport building. The landing and takeoff strips of Kai Tak Airport fascinated Nancy. They were on a spit of man-made land, and she realized how skillful a pilot had to be to use them. "We're on the China mainland," said Bess. "Not Hong Kong Island at all." "That's right," said George, who had studied the map. "This Kai Tak Airport actually is in the city of Kowloon." "How do you get over to Hong Kong Island? Bess queried. By ferry, George replied. All this time, Nancy, who now had a window seat, was looking intently at the crowd of people waiting behind a wire mesh fence. She hoped to see Ned Nickerson among them. Oh, there he is! A tingle of excitement rushed up and down Nancy's spine. The plane stopped and the exit door was opened. First-class passengers disembarked. Mr. Drew hurried toward the fence behind which he had spied Ned Nickerson. Hello, Mr. Drew, the tall, good-looking, athletic young man called. Where are the girls? They're coming. The lawyer laughed. I traveled in style. They're in the tourist section. At that very moment, the girls were moving toward the exit. George was saying, I hope that pesky Mrs. Truesdale won't stop us and try to find out what we're going to do. The three girls finally went down the steps and exchanged gay greetings with Ned through the wire fence. Then the four travelers entered the low, white administration building. Here they went through the immigration formalities and customs examination. Finally, they collected their baggage, then hurried to meet Ned in the waiting room. It's sure good to see you, the young man said, giving Mr. Drew a hearty handshake and kissing each of the girls. I have a jalopy outside. I guess we can all crowd into it. Did you get us hotel accommodations? Mr. Drew asked him. Yes, at the Peninsula Hotel. That's right here in Kowloon, and I'm sure you will like it. He chuckled. Since prices are lower than in the States, I engaged a 3-bedroom suite with a living room. Nancy may want to entertain one or more villains. Including yourself? Nancy teased. Call me anything you like, Ned responded, but just let me stick around. How much time can you spend away from Chung Chi College? Nancy asked him. A few days. Well, shall we go? Ned escorted the group outside the building. 2 porters stowed the luggage in Ned's small foreign car, then everyone got in. Bess giggled. It's a tight squeeze. As the visitors approached the business section of Kowloon, they became more and more intrigued with the city. Most of the buildings were not more than 3 stories high, and Chinese signs hung everywhere. There were many Western people walking about, but the bulk of the populace was Chinese. Native men, women, and children wore pants and loose-fitting straitjackets. Most of the suits were black and plain, but here and there one would see someone wearing a beautifully embroidered garment. Presently, Ned drove to the hotel and residential area, where the streets were broad. The Peninsula Hotel was a large, attractive building. They entered the long, curving driveway and alighted at the front entrance. This is very charming, Mr. Drew remarked, as the travelers walked through the lobby to the registration desk. The whole central section was filled with couches, lounge chairs, palms, flowers, and tea tables. People, seated in groups, were sipping tea and eating small cakes. As soon as the Drews and their friends had unpacked and freshened up a bit, they met in their living room. Ned demanded to hear all about the mystery on which the 3 girls had been working. When they finished telling him, he whistled and said, You really picked up a honey this time, Nancy. So you think Chi-Che might be a prisoner here in Hong Kong? I believe there's a good possibility. But even if she isn't, I'm sure this is headquarters for the smuggling ring, and that she knows their secret. If the leaders can be rounded up, Chi-Che will automatically be released. I'm ready to help, Ned said. Nancy, when, where, and how do I start? The young sleuth thought for a moment. Then she replied, I want to show you something in my handbag. Nancy obtained the bag from her bedroom and took out the 2 pages which she had torn from the book on Asia. These are the sheets which upset Mr. Stromberg. Lily Alice said the words Mah-Jongg sets had been underlined. I don't believe she noticed in which shop. Now's your chance to be a detective, Ned. The young man took the sheets and read them carefully. Then a smile spread over his face. "I think I have a clue for you, Nancy," he said. "One of these shops is owned by a man named Long. The word Long was the original Chinese name for dragon." "Of course," Nancy said excitedly. "I remember now. Grandpa soon told us that. Let's go there first thing tomorrow morning." "Fine," Ned agreed. "George," said Bess, "this is our chance to go shopping for clothes and souvenirs." The next morning, Nancy and Ned started out directly after breakfast. They took Ned's car to the ferry, parked it, and went by boat to Hong Kong Island. As they crossed the bay, Nancy marveled at the surrounding scenery. The harbor was filled with boats of all kinds, large and small, including junks and sampans. The island ahead of them was almost like a stone fortress, which rose to a pinnacle in the center. "That is Victoria Peak, and it's 1,809 feet high," Ned told Nancy. "It's amazing how they build houses right into the side of a mountain," Nancy remarked. When she and Ned debarked, he hailed 2 rickshaws, and the couple climbed into them. Nancy was intrigued by the man pulling her little 2-wheeled vehicle. He trotted along after Ned's rickshaw at a pace that a horse would trot. Nancy found Hong Kong a fascinating combination of modern skyscrapers and quaint oriental buildings. Presently, the rickshaw men turned down an alley and in a few minutes stopped. They had arrived at Mr. Long's shop. "Like the ride?" Ned grinned. "It was fun," Nancy replied as they alighted. She and Ned entered the shop and gazed around at the wall decorations. Every one of them was a dragon in some form. There were painted scrolls, pictures, and a few wooden figures. Nancy shivered. "This is a creepy place," she whispered. There was a short counter toward the rear of the shallow shop. As the couple approached it, a man came from behind a curtain in back of the counter. "Mr. Long?" Ned asked. The man nodded. "We'd like to see some Mah-Jongg sets," Ned told him. Without a word, the shop owner took several from a shelf and gave the price of each. All the playing pieces were of ivory, but the less expensive sets were in plain boxes, while others were in carved teakwood chests lined with camphor wood. "These are very beautiful," Nancy said. "Do you have any others?" Mr. Long shook his head. "We have more that are similar, but these are samples of all the varieties I carry." Nancy examined the boxes carefully. It occurred to her that each one contained many places in which small articles could be secreted for smuggling. "What do you think?" Ned asked her, careful not to use Nancy's name. "Let's decide later," the young sleuth answered. "After all, we've just started to shop." She turned to Mr. Long. "Thank you very much. We'll probably be back." The man bowed and started to put the Mah-Jongg sets back on the shelf. Nancy and Ned left the shop and strolled up the alleyway. They had not gone far when Nancy heard a woman's familiar voice say loudly, "You charge too much." Turning, the girl saw Mrs. Horace Truesdale just alighting from a rickshaw. The woman, frowning, put some money in the man's hand, then walked into Mr. Long's shop. Quickly, Nancy told Ned of her encounter with Mrs. Truesdale, then whispered tensely, "Is it just coincidence that she knows Mr. Stromberg and came directly here to Mr. Long's shop? Or could Mrs. Truesdale, by some chance, be part of the smuggling ring?" End of chapter 15.